All right, so hopefully you've been able to connect a little bit, and we'll see how this goes as all the blood starts rushing to your stomach to digest your food, and you start getting tired. I will tell you I have a video clip coming, so if you're tired, just hold on for TV. That's the way it goes. All right, so where I left you in this is that we are at Secular 3, and as was pointed out by Arthur, we're not quite done with the diagram yet. We're getting there. So remember, just a quick review on Secular 3. We said Secular 3 is the fragilization of all belief. Remember, we said that's a two-way fragilization. If you believe, you have these moments of doubting, but if you don't believe, you can also find that unbelief fragilized, and you have moments of believing. Now, one of the environments I think we all share inside of a Secular 3 age, and I do think this is one of the reasons to answer our first why question of why is it so hard to be a pastor, is because the people that you're doing ministry with and you yourself live inside of what Charles Taylor calls an immanent frame. Okay, that's a little bit of a mouthful here, an immanent frame. His point is that we all live and see the world through some kind of framework. And it's given to us by our larger society, the institutions we live in and things like that. Again, to think back to Secular 0, the frame you would see the world in would be very much so a supernatural one. Something weird happens, you assume God or the devil is at work. For most of us, the frame that we see the world in is more of a natural and material one. It's more of immanent instead of transcendent. It's within instead of without. Again, remember my little story about your mother funeral, same song. You can either say, oh my gosh, God is speaking to me through this song on the radio, or you can say, oh my gosh, Jeffrey Bezos is listening to everything. There must be some natural material answer to this. There must be some algorithm that is making this happen. So here's how Taylor describes the immanent frame. There's Chuck Taylor. Isn't he just a nice old man you want to give a hug to? He says, the immanent frame is a constructed social space that frames our lives entirely within a natural rather than a supernatural order. It's the circumscribed space of the modern social imaginary that precludes transcendence. Take a breath. It has been scientifically proven that philosophers' quotes have tryptophan in it. So if that makes you incredibly tired, you are not alone. I like reading Taylor a great deal, but I also see the world through pop culture references. So to help this quote make sense, let's go to a pop star's lyrics. All right, now that makes me seem really cool, except you're going to realize that like this pop song's like 12 years old. Like, it's not a new song, but forget that part. Just think I'm cool. I need it. I'm a middle-aged man who needs to think he's cool. So this comes from an artist named Lily Allen. Do people know who Lily Allen is? British pop star. Some of you might know who she is. I'm going to say something very controversial. Lily Allen is who Katy Perry wishes she was. All right, so if you're a Katy Perry fan, you know I just crossed a line with you. But Lily Allen is very much like she is a kind of edgier Katy Perry. Her music is very poppy, but it's also very irreverent, very middle finger in your face. So she has a song that's called The Fear, and I think it illustrates this point really well. And here's one of the lyrics. She says, life's about film stars and less about mothers. But it doesn't matter because I'm packing plastic, and that's what makes my life so effing fantastic. All right, let me confess to you all, I have no idea what that means. Like no clue whatsoever. I think it is dangerous to try to exegete and interpret pop stars' lyrics. I'm not sure what that means. I'm not sure what packing plastic means. It probably means she has a credit card with a very large credit limit on it. More than likely, it means she has chosen to have one part of her body enhanced. That therefore is the measure of the good life, regardless. Like this is the measure of what it means to be living well. So you get it. Very irreverent, very in your face, very kind of middle finger. But this is it's the next lyric that I want to illustrate the immanent frame. She says, I'm a weapon of massive consumption. It's not my fault. It's how I'm programmed to function. Now here it is. Now I'm not a saint. But I'm not a sinner, but everything's cool as long as I'm getting thinner. I'm not a saint, I'm not a sinner, but everything's cool as long as I'm getting thinner. Again, it's said in jest. It's said kind of just to rile you up, but it's also incredibly insightful. So here it is. The Western experience, the Christian experience, has been a deep sense that people care. I mean, I told you, like 100 years before the Reformation, there were reform movements happening because people really cared. Is the church leading us into heaven or hell? Am I bound for heaven or hell? What saints can help me prepare for heaven or hell? I mean, perspectives that we still hold to, some that we've let go. Nevertheless, people really cared. Am I a saint or a sinner? Am I bound for heaven or bound for hell? People really cared about that for thousands of years, all the way up until 2012 when this pop star writes this lyrics. All right, we're not going to give her that much credit. But she reflects something. I mean, at the core of the Protestant experience is good old Martin Luther, who wakes up in the middle of the night and cannot fall back asleep because he is tortured by this question. Is he a saint or is he a sinner? He wears out. Like there is, not literally, but almost, a groove in the floor of Luther walking back and forth to his confessor, confessing his sins in the monastery. Because he would confess them, and then he would go away, and then come back and confess them, and then confess them again, and then he would walk away and be like, I feel really good about this. I feel unburdened. And then you'd think, feeling unburdened, is that a sin? And then he would go back and confess to the point where his confessor, Stupitz, had to tell him, Marty, do something wrong before you come back to me. But he was just so anxious about this, like not being able to sleep, the anxiety grabbing his imagination in the middle of the night. Am I a saint or am I a sinner? Well, of course, Luther's breakthrough is to read Romans again. And he finds in Romans, it's one of his great constructive theological moves, that it's really not an either or, it's a both and. That through the justifying work of Jesus Christ, you are sinner and saint through the work of Jesus Christ. And it became Luther's doctrine of the simul, simultaneously saint and sinner. And again, for Northern Europeans at least, it was a balm for almost 500 years. And then you have this pop star, and her response is, never happened to me. I mean, never once, she's essentially saying, have I woke up in the middle of the night, stared at the ceiling and been like, I can't fall back asleep. I can't fall back asleep. Am I a saint or am I a sinner? Never once has she been overwhelmed with that anxiety. But she has been overwhelmed with anxiety. She has not been able to fall back asleep. It just so happens that the source of her anxiety or her concern or her greatest concern is not transcendent. It is imminent. Swimsuit season's coming. What are people going to think of me? And that is not to say it's superficial. I don't mean to say that. We could say that, but I don't think it is. I don't mean to say it's superficial, but I do mean to say that its direction, where that comes from, where that anxiety comes from, is not from without, but from within. Not from without the natural material, but from within it. This is the imminent frame. Most, to maybe overstate it, most people in your congregation are very concerned, very worried. Most of those concerns are natural material concerns. Doesn't mean they're not important, but they are more natural material than transcendent and imminent. Hence, we were just talking at the break, why at times a therapist or an app seems much more helpful than a pastor. And if a pastor can do the therapeutic work, that's great. But people aren't all that concerned about how they stand before a holy God necessarily, but really concerned with how they cope with stress, which stress often comes from natural materially. Now, I'm not trying to downplay that. I think that's just significant, but it's very different. When you preach, you're preaching often to people whose first framework is an imminent framework. And Protestantism, the churches that have quote unquote grown have tended to concede to more of those imminent realities. So preaching is not Calvin and Luther and Wesley what it means to stand before a holy God. It can easily become 3 things to help you be the business partner you want it to be. 6 ways to raise your kids the right way. Again, not to be flippant, Some of that stuff is needed, but very different than this preaching the word of God. Here is the word of the Lord. Hear the word of the Lord today. People need that. It also is very hard for them to imagine that, how you break through that imminent frame. So Taylor says this. He says, we can't help looking over our shoulders from time to time, looking sideways, living our faith in a condition of doubt and uncertainty. And again, I remind you that he is a deep, committed Catholic and feels this kind of sense of how we wrestle with that. But his point is, again, there's no one who really escapes this, or very small percentages of people who escape it. And even someone like Lily Allen, who is very irreverent, I'm not a saint, I'm not a sinner, everything's cool as long as I'm getting thinner. I'm a weapon of massive consumption, very in your face. You get the verses are very irreverent. But what's fascinating is in the chorus of this song, you get a probing. You get a longing. And Taylor says this, is living in this kind of secular 3 age, we often find ourselves crossed up. We feel cross pressure. We feel like we've got it figured out, and then it crosses us up. And so Lily Allen says this. She says, I don't know what's right or what's real anymore. I don't know how I'm meant to feel anymore. When do you think it all becomes clear? Because I'm being overtaken by the fear. So there is a deep sense of fear and anxiety within this. Now, what I should do, what would make just complete sense, is to now play this song for you. But that would just, that would be just too right on the nose. So I'm not going to do that. But I am going to play another song for you, which I think is a really interesting song. And this does make me seem a little cooler because it comes from a little indie band that, to be quite honest, as another confession, I had never heard of. But some guy from Canada was like, hey, I think this kind of connects to what you're talking about. And so he's given me permission to steal it. And so I want to play this song for you. And so it comes from a band called Purple Mountains. And the name of the song is Margaritas at the Mall. So I want you to listen to the song. You'll see the lyrics will come up, and then we'll have some opportunity to discuss it. But there's 3 things I need to tell you about this song that you need to know going in. First of all, the singer-songwriter sounds a lot like Johnny Cash. So I just think that's kind of cool. He's got a nice Johnny Cash voice to him. The second thing to know is this is not someone who's probably ever in his life walked through the door of a church. This is not someone who grew up in a church. This is someone who has no connection to any kind of faith community at all. So just keep that in mind. And then the third thing to say is I just have to apologize right off the bat, because this song is catchy. And this is going to get so stuck in your mind that 3 days from now, you are going to curse my name because you're going to be unloading the dishwasher and you're going to start humming Margaritas at the Mall. Or if you're of the age where you need to use the bathroom at 2:30 in the morning, you're going to get up and you're going to go to the bathroom and start humming Margaritas at the Mall, and you're going to get really angry with me. But what I want you to do is when that happens, when all of a sudden Margaritas in the Mall starts coming up in your memory, I want you to stop, and I want you to pray. And I want you to say, God, are you telling me now to go onto Amazon and buy an Andy Root book? All right. That was the most crass, pietist joke ever. That was a crass consumer joke. I totally apologize. All right. I just wanted to set you up for that. All right, okay. So listen to the song. You'll see the lyrics come up. What lyric really captures your imagination? And we may, sound guys, need to turn this up a little bit. This is my quietest clip. Is that how we got to a world where you are now pastoring to people and witnessing to, testifying to a very subtle God? How do you do ministry when people's presumption is that this is a subtle God? And yet the God of the Bible and the God of Israel seems anything but subtle. And yet that's part of the presumption. What else jumped out? Yeah.
50 doors of understanding, 49 are closed.
Yeah.
And in my mind, that suggested also Jubilee.
7
times 7.
Yeah.
Which I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, and I honestly don't know what he really means by that, except there is something really fascinating, which is the kind of sense of even numbers telling a larger story of something fuller. And he does talk about, like, going before the throne. And there is a kind of, if you will, a kind of apocalyptic sense of this, of what can be known. And I guess it's back to, we know all sorts of stuff now in the God of the gaps, and yet he feels quite impoverished in some ways with that. Yeah. What other line jumped out? Yeah.
Just the self-God juxtaposed to the descriptive colors that he mentioned.
Yeah.
You could articulate the colors of margaritas.
Yeah. It's a fascinating point. Yeah, I mean, margaritas at the mall. It's what this stuff adds up to after all. And this is the world you do ministry in, that you inherit a world that, again, at one level, it's kind of nice. Kind of nice to live in a world where around every corner, in every action, and every thought, doesn't bear the weight of divine consequence. That's Taylor's point. That's a construction. That doesn't just happen. We have to create that. And there are advantages to a world where you can do that. But what else is there? Is that enough? Is that enough for the human spirit? Is margaritas enough? And I do think as ministry leaders, this is really quite fascinating to think about, is that one of the ways to deal with our world is to say, in the context of the church, is that if your church is going to survive, we get locked in that secular two frame. If your church is going to survive, you got to find more participants. And you're going to need to do that by making your church more like a mall. I mean, that has been the move of Protestantism in the 80s in and through the 21st century, is that our congregations life need to look more like a mall. And if you want to get people to come, get a margarita machine at your church. Now, of course, we all come from certain traditions where that probably would not be good, but how often have we said, barista? That would do it. That will bring them. That will be able to win space back. And my point, one of the main takeaways I want you to get from this is you could do it, but here's what's really potentially at risk. You do it, and it may actually even win you more butts in the seats. But you move people in, you form them to be more embedded in an immanent frame. You actually form them to not have an imagination for a living God. And that there's cost to that. There's cost to it. Yeah, you had your hand up. Yeah.
The colors.
Yeah.
And because it was acid, green, and mercury, which are poison.
Yeah.
And he caught.
Yeah.
So he's recognizing that
Yeah.
are not
Yeah.
good for him.
Yeah. They are a very delicious poison. Yeah. Remind me about the Zoom. I don't want to forget that. Yeah.
I wonder if these words are the same as the words of the prophets are written on the subway walls
Yeah.
50 years ago.
Yeah.
Have the same meaning?
Yeah. You say more about what you mean by that.
Well, in those years, we
Yeah.
thought that indicating that God is not
Uh-oh.
what you expect God to be.
Yeah.
Look on the subway walls at what people are
I see.
hieroglyphics.
Yes. Yeah. So I'm trying to remember to repeat this for Zoom. Like, does this have a correlation? And the way I'm hearing what you're saying is we could see on subway walls even 30, 40, 50 years ago these assertions. And has there been this kind of longing within our cultural context for a while to get back to a larger horizon than we often give? I think so. Now, what's really quite sad about this, and this that does take us to this kind of tragic level, this is the person who wrote this, the leader of this band is a guy by the name of David Berman, and he killed himself right at the beginning of the pandemic. And so I think one of the things Charles Taylor would remind us is that it is really true that belief has its consequences. And in some ways across Protestantism right now, younger generations are bringing older generations to a reckoning on what we believed and the potential problems with some of that. But I think Charles Taylor would also remind us that unbelief has its consequences. That without having a larger horizon, that too has its consequences. I don't want to go too far and make a one-to-one correlation, but I will say his own reflections are someone who's tortured with a deep sense of wanting something more. And we see something similar in Julian Barnes' memoir, where he starts it by saying, I don't believe in God, but boy, do I miss God. That's part of what it means to live in secular 3. That's the context in which you do ministry. Yeah.
Am I correct in saying, sort of summarizing this, is our current age is, it's futile? Futility, that's the word that I keep kind of
Yeah.
in my mind.
It's definitely a fair assertion. Now, one of the things that's fascinating about Taylor that I actually quite share and can be maddening is that he refuses to dismiss anyone's way of living their lives. So in other words, I'll as we go a little bit further, I'll unpack this. He wants to respect that someone who simply says, I don't believe this, or I guess a better way to say this is he thinks any form of human action has deep moral assertions to it. That there's a way that this is to bring someone fullness, and they do it because he thinks we are the kind of creatures who are always aimed towards some good. We could be wrong about it. We could actually be corrupted by it. But people do what they do not because they even are just like hedonists. He thinks they do it because we're moral animals. That we always do it because we think this is going to give us a good life. What he wants to challenge, however, is could our whole society have created a moral vision that doesn't need any transcendent living God? And does that actually produce the depth we need? Does that actually speak to the Spirit the way that we need it to speak to? So at that level, you are right. He wonders if this flatness, if we're not choking on the sawdust of it. But he doesn't want us to ever go to the perspective of saying, and I quite agree with this thing is all just dumb and stupid. He thinks that there are reasons we've constructed this. There's reasons that we've done this, that we've done it because we think it's going to give us a good life or give us a good society, but it may turn on us. And he does think that it turns on us in a big way here, that there isn't a big enough horizon. But he prophetically reminds us we should always really respect our neighbor when our neighbor talks about what gives their life meaning. And our first response should be to listen to that and be aware of it. But we also should not be shy in saying respectfully, I don't buy it. I don't think it's big enough. I don't think it's beautiful enough. I don't think it encompasses enough. That is a legitimate way too. But it also is to respect, like, I need to hear that. So there is a futility to it. But he doesn't think it's just he really thinks that this is a construction. One of the things he's opposed to is what he calls subtraction stories. And I think in Protestantism, as American Protestants, we've lived with a lot of subtraction stories. Like you get to, like for instance, this would be an example, like the reason we're in a time where no one goes to church is because we lost X or Y. Once you took this out, it all went to this. Once movie theaters were open on Sundays, once parents didn't feel guilty about not getting their kids to church, those all may be points, but it's never just one thing. It's never just take this out. This is not a subtraction, it's a construction. We have to construct a world like this. And we construct it for some good reasons and some bad reasons. But futility is he wonders. And surely our songwriter here is not so sure that margaritas at the mall is enough to feed the human soul. But it's what this all adds up to. Again, you hear not a subtraction, but an add up to. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Of others, and as a way of ongoing honoring of them.
Mm-hmm.
I think about Tim Keller going and giving Google talks.
Mm-hmm.
He taught meaning of marriage, reason for God at Google.
Mm-hmm.
And the first 5 minutes, he puts on a clinic
Mm-hmm.
on how to honor people with different stories.
Mm-hmm.
And say, you all have your own theology, you all have your own.
Sure.
So I'm going to share with you mine.
Mm-hmm.
And I've found him to be really helpful in that
Mm-hmm.
dynamic of like, I'm not going to discredit
Yeah.
us to be like, those stories are bad,
Yeah.
go get study mine.
Yeah.
You seem to be saying, maybe there's this third way,
Yeah.
honoring their story, but get to know their story.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, to take that on now, and again, I'm trying not to. We have a diagram to finish here, and so and we're gonna get there, and so but I want to respond to you now, and I'll just let this land, and then I will kind of tease it out as we go here. But he thinks, I agree with him on this, is that you have an option inside of this. And your option really is to take, and this is confusing with him, so again, we'll come back to it so that it can resonate here. But he says you can either have what he calls an open take or a closed spin. An open take or a closed spin. And this is where he really reveals his own colors as a believing Christian person, where he thinks, my gosh, the best way to live in this world. And he thinks none of us can escape the imminent frame. So you never have an option, and you would be outside of reality, really, if you thought, well, I'm going to opt out of the imminent frame. I mean, you would have to not go to school. I mean, there's just no way. We all have this kind of imminent frame. He thinks we all live in that. Whether we're a believer or not believer, we all live in the imminent frame. But you have a choice inside the imminent frame, is that you can live with this open take, the sense that it's open, that God can break in it, that there's deeper meaning. Or you can live with a closed spin, which is that you just are not open to that at all. And I'll try to explain that a little more as we go. But he does really think that there's almost an evangelistic impulse that you have to respond with. He thinks the best way is to live with an open take, and therefore you have to be open to hearing other people's takes. Now, it's really fascinating and makes some of us uncomfortable, but he does not think that's possible inside of Secular 3 to pound your fist on the table and say, we know this conclusively. You can only have a take, but it might be a take, and it should be a take that you're willing to die for. But it's a take. It's a wager. I mean, it's you think of Pascal here. It's like a wager that this is the most beautiful way to live. This is the fullest way to live. And his point is you can have real discourse and discussion around people's takes. And you could come back and say, yeah, I don't buy it. I think that this is deeper. I think there's a deeper way to look at this. But it does call for some level of humility, that I really do want to listen to what people think. And that's scary at certain levels, but it also is quite necessary inside of this. So I would say that we have to listen to our neighbor, but never outside of the fact that you do have to have something normative you stand on. You will. You do, even if you're not aware of it, there are some larger moral stories that you hold on to. Even Wendy has those strongly. And so it's never to say like this is some kind of open relativist thing. Taylor actually really pushed back against the early 2000s kind of deconstructionist, like French post-structuralist, that there really is no story, there is nothing. He just thinks that's not true. Every human being lives out of some story that they hold to be normative and moral, that they hold on to. But those always do collide with other stories, and we learn along the way, but we make claims along the way. But really where I want to push us to think about that is it will always mean that the confession of the Christian faith will come from the humility of a community that's actually living it. That will have to say, well, I get your perspective, but I don't know, I could never agree. Because when we pray, something happens. Well, how do you know that's God? How do you know it's not just a psychological reality? Maybe it is. But I also know we were dead and now we're made alive. We were lost and now we're found. Like that becomes, and especially in Secular 3, a very necessary way of proclaiming it. But it will have to be a community of people who lives it and then makes that assertion from within that. I know that take sounds like it's really open and relative. No, like a take is that you're betting your life that this is the narrative that brings salvation. How do you know for sure? Never will. Other than you've experienced the living God in the midst of it. Yeah.
I mean, that was his struggle.
Mm-hmm.
He said, at the end of the day, it's all futile, and my relationship with God is what's
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. All else gets washed away. All right, let me tell you one story that maybe illustrates this, lands this a little bit. Then I'm going to get you talking in groups a little bit, and we'll continue to push this on. And I know, Arthur, I keep going back about finishing the diagram, but we'll get there. We'll get there, I promise. So here's a story that maybe illustrates this, and maybe kind of frames this and gives you kind of a picture even what this looks like in the context of ministry, and maybe gives us a few handles as we continue to go down the road. So a few years ago now, I had read this book, and some of you maybe have seen this book, called When God Talks Back. So again, what I really want to point to you is that I think our biggest issue in the context of ministry is how do we help a community of people hear again the voice of the living God? That's to me the real element here of what we're trying to get to. And it's so easy to say your most important job is just to try to get more people to come. And I want us to be really careful with that we don't fall into that trap. But what does that look like? So I read this book called When God Talks Back. It's written by a woman named Tanya Lerman. She writes under the name T.M. Lerman. She's an anthropologist. Her official field, she's a psychological anthropologist. Now, I didn't know that existed, but she's got tenure at Stanford, so it must be real, is what I've come to conclude. So she writes this book, and one of the things she says is that she's really fascinated that amongst all the other kind of conflicts we have in our cultural world, there's one where there are people, it's a small percentage of people, but a percentage of people who talk very easily about God speaking to them. And God seems to tell them all sorts of things, like who to marry or where to go to college or whatever. And she says there are other people, the majority of other people, who think people who talk like that are suspect and maybe out of their mind, maybe even a sign of low-grade schizophrenia or something. So she decided she wanted to explore this and see if that's true, and you can hear her field. She's an anthropologist who looks at psychological categories. This would be interesting. So like a good anthropologist, she joins a vineyard church in the Pentecostal denomination, and she lives 3 years with them. 3 years. She then moves to Northern California. She joins another vineyard congregation and lives with them another 3 years, 6 years. She ends the book in the most beautiful way. She says, first of all, she says, could we say that people who say they hear God speak to them are just manifesting kind of low-grade schizophrenia or some other kind of mental health issues? She says, absolutely not. There's no correlation in any way. Now, can I say that they're actually hearing God speak to them? I'm an anthropologist from Stanford who's looking to get, promoted. I can't say if they're really talking to God. But I can say that during living in these communities, my father died. And their prayers saw me through. There was something deeply beautiful about this. And I was just kind of mesmerized by this. But I thought, what would happen if you went to a couple traditions and a couple churches that you weren't rewarded for saying that God speaks to you? In most Pentecostal denominations, you kind of are rewarded. It's natural to say God speaks to you. But you go to a Presbyterian or a Lutheran church and you say God speaks to you, people get they move a pew. They're not sure what to make of that. So I thought, well, okay, what if I went to the Pacific Northwest and I went to 2 PCUSA churches and 1 ELCA church, 2 Presbyterian, 1 Lutheran, and I asked people if they've heard God speak to them. So I did this thing called life history interviewing, which is a form of qualitative research, where you just create 6 big questions. You interview people for about an hour. With their permission, you record it, and then you look for themes. So I asked these people, have you ever had an experience where you have a real sense that God spoke to you? Now, it was only 12 people, so I'm not making an assertion like this is conclusive across the world. But out of those 12 people, everyone I talked to said, oh yeah, I've had an experience where I feel like God spoke to me. Now, what was fascinating is I had some people go, whenever anyone says, like to my question, like whenever anyone says God speaks to them, I don't trust those people. I actually hate it. I hate when anyone says God speaks to them. I hate that. I had a man who was probably mid-70s, close to 80, say that. I just hate it. I don't trust anyone whoever says God speaks to him. I just hate that. And he says, except one time. Everyone had an at least one-time story. It was fascinating. And they were all these beautiful stories. And so then I would say to them, man, this is a really beautiful story. Have you ever told anyone in your church this story? No, never told anyone in my church this story. I said, well, okay, clearly you've told your pastor because your pastor nominated you to talk to me, so you've told your pastor this story. Nope, never told my pastor this story. No wonder the imminent frame feels so cold, so closed off, that we don't share these stories. But I want to share the last interview I did was with the youngest person in the sample. She's probably 35 years old, and her name was Rachel. And I went to her pastor's office, and it was a Sunday morning, and she came in, and her body language just communicated she wanted to be anywhere but talking to me. She explained she was busy. She had 2 kids, kind of early elementary age. She drives 20 minutes to church. Yeah. Okay, next question. Let's go. Come on, get this over with. Let's see if we can get this done in 20 minutes. On and on and on it went. And I just thought, okay, this isn't going to work. That's okay. But I had one more question, so I thought I would ask it. And I said, so, Rachel, have you ever had an experience where you felt so deeply ministered to that you felt like it was the very presence of Jesus Christ? And her whole disposition changed, and she said, actually, I have. She said, I never told this story before. So I've been saying throughout this interview that I'm a single mom, but I've never told you why I'm a single mom. I'm a single mom because 4.5 years ago, my husband got on a plane and flew from Seattle to Chicago for a business trip. She said he was gone 13 and a half hours. It's supposed to be a 3-day trip. I get a phone call, and there's a very awkward man on the other line. And this young man says, hi, ma'am. So, ma'am, I'm calling because, ma'am, as you know, your husband stayed here at our hotel. Okay, ma'am, I'm really sorry. I've just never done anything like this. So, ma'am, your husband, he stayed here. Ma'am, your husband stayed here last night, and ma'am, there seems to be a terrible accident. So, ma'am, I don't know how to tell you, ma'am, your husband is dead. Our cleaning crew went through your husband's room this morning. We saw something was terribly wrong. We called the ambulance. Ambulance came. They've pronounced him dead on the scene. My manager is dealing with it now. He's asked me to call you, which felt cruel, call you and give you the address of the hospital morgue we've sent his body to. She says as he's saying this to her, as he finally can make it coherent, she just can't make sense of it. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. Finally, it clicks and it makes sense. And she says she has this just visceral sense that all the color gets sucked out of the room. And she's now just living in a black and white world. And she looks at her 2 children. She's got like a toddler and a preschooler or something. And she thinks her first thought to herself is, my life is over. I have no idea how I'm going to survive this. She writes down the hospital morgue on a little business card. She ends the call. She calls her mother, asks her to come stay with her children, makes flight arrangements. She's going to fly to Chicago, identify the body, sign the paperwork she needs to, get back on a plane, and go home. She knows no one in Chicago. She gets on the plane, she flies. She tells me, flight lasted 15 minutes. It lasted 15 days. She says, my grief was so heavy, I didn't even feel like I was in time. She gets to O'Hare, she goes down to the cab stand, she gives the cabbie the card with the address, and he drives. She said, I should have noticed this, but I was drowning in grief. I didn't notice anything. But he didn't drop me off out front. He parked. But she says she walks in, and they had her itinerary. They knew when she was going to be there. And as soon as she came, they took her to the side room, and she said she waited there, maybe 30 seconds. It felt like forever. And as she's waiting there, she knows this is it. This is the moment she's dreaded. This is the moment when we become realer than real, that he's gone. They will wheel the gurney up, and she'll have to identify the body. And it happens. The gurney comes into the room. Man grabs the sheet to pull back and reveal her husband's body. And just as that's happening, she feels a hand on her shoulder. And she feels an arm come around the front with a water bottle. And she starts crying in her pastor's office. And she says to me, "It was the cabbie. It was the cabbie." She said, "I never felt more ministered to. I got back on that flight, and I didn't know how I was going to put my life back together. But I knew God had not abandoned me. I knew Jesus Christ would see me through." And then, like all the others, she said, "I've never told anyone that story before." How long can the world go on under such a subtle God? This God is not subtle. This God is turning death into life. And yet, I think our biggest concern is, do we need a margarita machine to get more people to come? Instead of the invitation for people to make these kind of confessions, to embrace one another in the midst of them. And to be quite honest, I know nothing. This is completely fictional and made up, but I know nothing about that cabbie. But he needs a community to make sense of this. He needs to stumble into some church on a Wednesday night or a Sunday morning and be like, "I got to tell you all what happened to me. I was on my last run of the day. I've been up all night making airport runs. I was going to make this last run and go home. Woman passed me the card with the address on it. I caught her eye in the rearview mirror, and I could just sense it. I could sense right away she was up against something. And then I knew that address. I knew it well. Because when my cousin Ronnie had his heart attack at work and died, that's where they took his body. And I remember my auntie throwing herself on the floor in grief. And something inside me, I don't know what it was. Maybe it was the Holy Spirit. I just heard it vividly. Don't leave her alone. Don't leave her alone. But I tell you, I don't know what I did. Maybe I didn't do it right. Maybe, I don't know. All I could think is just to put my hand on her shoulder and be there for her. He needs a community of people that says, "Behold, the Lord has moved. You have been a minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ." This is a gift to this community. This is not a subtle God. But this is a God who moves from underneath. This is a God who always moves from the cross, embracing suffering to bring life out of death. And it is good, but it takes eyes to see it. And it takes space to hear it. Or else we'll just imminent frame it. And the best pastor won't be the one who makes that space, but will be the one who can battle for more market share. And that's a big difference. Let's breathe. I don't know any way other than that dramatic story to make a smooth shift. But let's, I don't know, Derek, can we let's take a 10-minute break? Well, and that's what we're going to do. So what we'll do is we're going to take 10 minutes and then come back. So come back just a bit before 2 o'clock. And I'll have some questions up on the board. That's not a board, on a screen. And I'll have some questions up on the screen, so you can pull one of those questions or you can go where the Spirit leads you. But we'll give you another 15 minutes to have that conversation, 10, 15 minutes. So use the facilities, get some coffee, and then talk, and then we'll all start again about 10 after 2. Does that sound like a fair plan? All right. All right, let's come back together here. So any thoughts or insights or questions that come from your groups that you want to share here? We're good? You're exhausted? Any thoughts you want to share from your groups? You good? Yeah, please.
Why do you think secular 2 is so captivating? question was,
Yeah.
for which group?
Yeah.
Or the non?
Yeah, and I guess the way I was thinking of the question is, why is it so captivating for ministry leaders? Like, or their lay leadership, where it feels like you always kind of get sucked in to thinking that. Yeah, I think it's probably true. I guess I got to think about this more, but probably true that people that are unconnected don't really care. Like it isn't captivating to them. That's why they don't come. But yeah, I think at least my experience is that it becomes incredibly captivating to kind of ministry leaders. Like even when you want out of the race of trying to win market share, it feels like it's hard to get out of it. Yeah, please.
Well, at the same time, I think secular zero is for captivating and compelling
Yeah.
lay people. If we could just get back to how things were,
Sure.
we could get the right people in the right office.
Yeah.
We could just get people back in the building.
Yeah.
To be gatekeepers of the divine.
Yeah.
That's super captivating to the
Interesting.
to at least some of the congregations that I've served.
Yeah.
And so then secular two
Yeah.
is the antidote to that.
Sure.
Leaders like,
Yep.
let's try
We're gonna pass you a mic so that yeah.
Thanks, Derek.
Yeah. Okay. I'll try to recap that, and then that there's certain ways that these different three seculars captivate people's imaginations, whether lay people or ministry leaders or whatever, and there can be this sense of maybe it's more than just, hey, we don't want our church to die, but it's also like we want people to know this. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, that's a really good thought. Yeah, over here. We'll get you the mic. It's always best if we can go from this side to that side, so we can watch Derek run from each side.
Yeah, thank you. So, moving, I'm not sure that this question really matters because we're talking about how to minister in these contexts.
Yeah.
But I'm also interested in what's driving the changes.
Yeah.
Why do we move from secular 1 to 2 to
Yeah.
3? Would it be appropriate to talk about the difference between 2 and 3 as moving from a modernist to a postmodern? Is postmodern in here? And
That's a good question. Yeah.
or is the only thing that matters is this is the context, and so how do we respond to the context as opposed to what's driving underneath?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, I would be one to say that it does really matter what's pushing them. I mean, that's, I guess, how I'm making my living, is trying to describe these changes, right? And I do think it does really matter. And I think most often what is moving them is happening kind of behind our backs. Like we don't recognize it, we don't see it, it's just kind of happening. And in some ways, what brings all these changes are very big historical events that we really can only recognize retrospectively, but they are kind of sweeping us along this way. And I do tend to think that they're pretty big movements. Like we were talking earlier, I think we all are living after 1968, that we all are kind of living in this more kind of bohemian authenticity way. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And that change comes because of the way, like I was saying before, marketing works and the way we think about the economy and things like that. So I do think we have to name them, but what I still want to name them not just so we can kind of be hip and have a sense of what's happening, but because I think they end up shaping the way we see the world and then minister to others within it, and the way we think of what's a good church and what's a good pastor, and that we should be aware of how those form us. So then, is this postmodern? Is this modern? It's fascinating, and maybe you'll find this controversial. I kind of miss those conversations. Like back in the early 2000s, everyone was like poking each other in the eye if they were modern or postmodern. And it feels like in the larger zeitgeist, even outside the church, we've all returned to some kind of form of modernism.
Can you define that differently?
Yeah. I mean, this is part of what was always really difficult, even in the conversation, is how we would define those. So the way that we often thought of that is that the postmodern turn, which was really, in my mind, like the post-structuralist turn that came from French intellectuals, was simply to say, for the most part, everything is just a social construction. There really is nothing but social constructions. So, therefore, there is no claims any story could really make that have any ultimacy other than what you give them. So, yeah, you might think this is true, but that's because you've decided to hold that story. But that story has a certain historical construction to it. And so it really was in many ways a pushback to certain forms of scientific rationalism. To say, like, even science is really a story, and, like, is it really true? I don't know. These are all social constructions, So there was a certain kind of potential freedom in the fact that what you were to do was to deconstruct all the stories that you were holding as true that were really just social constructions. I don't think I see a younger generation that actually believes that anymore. They hold certain things to be not negotiated stories. They see them as fundamentally, almost, sorry, we're getting late in the day, ontologically true. And I don't want to go too much further than that because it gets very controversial, but really around questions of, like gender identity and things like that. There's less of a sense of like gender is just a socially constructed reality, so you could make it any way you want to make it. There's a certain kind of hard rationalist sense that it is this, so then I refuse it, and I'm not it. I'm being a little bit not direct because I just don't want to walk into a minefield here. But you see what I'm saying? Like, you first accept that this is what it means to be this, and I'm not that, so I must be completely this other thing. Instead of saying, like, well, I mean, at a certain level, any kind of social construction around what it would mean to be male or female is a social construction, and you could kind of be any kind of man or woman you want to be. It feels like there's now a certain response that I accept a kind of foundationalist knowledge and then I refuse it. So it's almost like a postmodern kind of perspective, and I'm just old. So it's like, gosh, I kind of miss like just the French post-structuralists, and I kind of miss like, didn't ever really agree with him, but just the like kind of like old school Marxists. And now things are, they're just so complicated in a kind of weird way. So it is a little bit like postmodernism, but it is much more of a deeply expressivist, individualist kind of perspective. Like, even the post-structuralists were deconstructing there was even a thing called the self. Just a narrative. That isn't true. Now we think the self is absolutely sacred and there is only a self, and your job is to create this unique self out of it. So it's a weird moment that way. So yeah. Oh, Mike.
So my kids are 24, 22, and I see a phenomenon. First of all, my son, environmental studies, so much anxiety.
Yeah.
So much anxiety. What is he going to do to save the world?
Yeah.
And then my younger daughter, which is 22, going to get married very soon. I won't be surprised if she has a child much younger than I thought, because she doesn't want to miss out on that. So that's my generation. I see it in front of me. And I just wonder, with these constructs, how normal that is. I think it's quite normal. And there's this sort of like, live for today because we don't know if we have tomorrow.
Yeah.
And that really, I mean, I'm looking at scripture, and I look at in Genesis, we're stewards of the world, so that's very important, and God so loved the world. But I mean, how do we respond to that? That's the anxiety that really, I mean, depression, anxiety, I see it rampant in this age.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. And so here we go. I'll fill this out, and then I'm always just nervous that I'm just, taking you on these rabbit trails. And so I don't know what the sign could be, but when you're like, okay, this is stop, Andy. Like, when my son once, I was putting him to bed, there you go, and he asked me some question, and I was talking, and he looked at me, he's probably 4, and he said, Daddy, use different words. So when it starts to go down a rabbit hole, you can say use different words, or we get it. But I think this is really true. So there's a theorist that I think is really quite brilliant, that particularly a lot of European philosophers and social theorists have drawn from, a guy by the name of Alan Ehrenberg, and he's Parisian, but that sounds so un-Parisian, like Alan Ehrenberg. But he's got this book, and it's called, in English, originally written in French, in English it's called The Weariness of the Self. But the exact translation from French is far more interesting, and I'm going to try to, is there any, first language French people here, people who speak French as first language? Good, so now I can butcher this, and you won't know. So it's called the La Fatigue d'être soi, the La Fatigue d'être soi, which literal translation is the fatigue of being yourself. And what it is it's a genealogy, and what he means by genealogy, which is I've been basically doing a genealogy for you today. This is the kind of point of looking at the kind of genes that give us this world we're in now, the little, the background that leads this. But he does one on depression. And he shows historically that the modern project always seems to create the conditions for some kind of mental distress within it. And we don't really know how to deal with it, hence the stories we put on these experiences. So before the modern project, say someone under a bridge yelling out, God's judgment is coming to Paris, God's judgment is coming to Paris. The whole narrative sense you lived in, again, secular zero, is you would have a sense that this could be an angel. This could be Jesus Christ. This homeless person living under a bridge, possible. Well, once you enter into a modern age, no one quite believes that anymore, but what you assume is that this person has gone mad. This person cannot correlate their being to reason, therefore is not trustworthy. And he shows that that's what we used to believe. We didn't know how to deal with that. We didn't know how to deal and make sense of it. We move on to the next period, and what we particularly see is that the ailment becomes hysteria. And particularly who deals with hysteria are bourgeois women. And we forget that Freud, in psychoanalysis, is based off his experience of doing rounds at a Parisian hospital with the hysterical wing. So say you're a bourgeois woman, your 4-year-old dies. You're still supposed to go out public-private. You're supposed to go out into the public realm and have it all together. You are a Victorian bourgeois woman. Well, what happens if the grief is just so heavy and you go out into the public and you break down and cry and you can't stop your grieving because you've lost your 4-year-old? What they do is they put you in a hospital and you become hysterical. Well, Freud interviewed these women to do his work as a doctor and realized that they all have deep narratives that they hadn't shared, deep burdens of shame, deep childhood experiences. And if he could allow those to be spoken, they could go on to a therapeutic process, but it was hysteria. Ehrenberg's point is that ends in around 1970. And in 1970, the issue that we really deal with is depression. This becomes a very present reality across the modern world. And what he thinks shifts is that we take on a different relationship with the self. And that we now have this overwhelming sense that we have to create our own selves. That we have to construct our own selves. That we have to perform this. And he thinks one of the things that happens in the reality of depression, now he doesn't mean this with individuals, because you can think of other individuals who need medication, but he thinks it's broad society that kind of creates this, is that once you run out of energy to continue to perform yourself, you just can become overwhelmed by a certain despondency, that you don't have the energy. So he actually has this quote where he says he doesn't think depression is an ailment of happiness, but an ailment of change. That you can't keep up with a constant need to change. And so another way to think about this is there's a philosopher named Byung-Chul Han, a Korean philosopher who writes and has lived mainly in Germany, but he says we've shifted from being a should-based society to being a could-based society. So we used to live under the burdens of the should. You should obey the 10 Commandments. You should follow in the paths of your ancestors. You should follow the creeds. You should. Could be harsh, could be difficult. But now we're released from the should and we live under the could. You could live your dream, but you failed. And the fascinating thing about that is every could you didn't meet is your fault. See, you can't blame the system. Only losers blame the system. If you're not happy, it's your fault. You should have made better decisions. I mean, in some sense, when we don't quite say this, it's politically incorrect, but if you don't have enough food, it's your fault. Don't blame Mark Cuban. Mark Cuban took all of his coulds and made $1 billion. It's loser talk to blame someone who has all that. I mean, come on, it's your fault. You should have done better. And this is it's a shocking kind of system. So no wonder you feel utterly depressed. Any unhappiness you have is because you failed yourself. And then you put on top of it ecological crisis and things like that. I do think we're in a kind of moment to kind of link on to your point about that. I mean, we're at a moment where it feels like probably some of you in this room carry the burden of a certain kind of ecclesial ecological crisis. I mean, we've kind of referenced that. And I hope one thing you'll leave with is knowing that, well, let me just say it this way, that you should not leave this room catastrophizing the situation. And when you feel under a lot of anxiety, it's very easy to catastrophize, which only makes the anxiety more intense. And so you need a different kind of narrative, but it's very, very easy to catastrophize right now. I can't tell you how many people I talk to who say things to me like, if we don't change, if we don't do something different, there's going to be no church in 2 years. No church in 20 years. Church is just going to be gone. And you think of that theologically. Really? The church is the body of Jesus Christ. The church will survive, and ultimately it is God's responsibility and not yours. Now, your denomination might not survive. You might not have your pension, and believe me, that's scary in itself. I would never minimize that. But the church will be fine. And more importantly, you need to remember, these are bad times. There's no way to sugarcoat it. We are not living in the golden era of ecclesial moments. But people, there's been far worse over 2,000 years. So last August, because we're going to have a senior, and because I'm trying to make good atheists and not bad atheists, and this was more my wife's decision than mine, we decided to walk the St. Cuthbert Way, which is a pilgrimage in southern Scotland that you walk into northern England, and you walk it to the holy island of Lindisfarne, which is beautiful. So you pick it up in Melrose, Scotland, and then you walk it to these abbeys, and then you finally walk across to this island that you can only access when the tide is out. And then you walk it on the mud flats. And there's a causeway that people can take too. So you walk it, and then a lot of people vacation there, holiday there, as the UK people and the British would say. You holiday there, and a lot of people come over just to get ice cream and things like that. So we walked it 62 miles, 70 days, made our kids pray the whole way. Well, not the whole way, but we did morning prayer, noonday prayer, evening prayer. Again, we're going to make good atheists. You got to practice this thing you're going to refuse, And so we get there and we walk the mud flats. It's very moving for us. For us, it really became, remember I told you, two oldest, raising an oldest. It was really a spiritual pilgrimage of letting our kids go. Not trying to control them, but trying to let them go. And we get there, and I felt like I was in good stead, because there's a story of Luther doing a pilgrimage, walking to Rome, and he gets to Rome in 1550, and his temper flares. He walks in and sees the decadence of Rome, and its state, and he just starts hating everything about it. Well, what happened to me is I get on the mud flats, we do it. All we have to do is walk like 400 yards to the Abbey, and we're done. And we get kind of pulled out onto the street with all these tourists. And I just hated every one of them. It was like, I walk 62 miles and you're going for ice cream? Get out of my way. It was not the holiest moment I've ever had on this thing. But we finish it, and then we go and we get into our accommodations. And it's great if you stay on the island, because after 3 o'clock, everyone's got to leave. They got to get their cars back over before the water comes in, covers the causeway. So you come out, and all of a sudden you're in a different place. There's now like 40 people on the whole island. And so we go over to the little church. This church was built in 1635. The Celtic Saint Aidan builds this church. At least some of those stones have been on top of each other since 635. So we go and do evening prayer in it. After, we're walking around this little church, and there's a sign in the back. The sign's about this big. It lists from 635 all the way to 2018 every prior, bishop, or vicar who has been the pastor of that church. 635 to 2018, where the new vicar, Sarah Hillis, came and took over that church. 635. Except when you look at it, there's an interesting moment around 900. There's 300 years, longer than America's been a country, 300 years of no vicar, no pastor, no abbot. Because Viking raiders came and took that island many different times, that the monks finally had to take St. Cuthbert's body and leave the island. Folks, we are in a difficult time. There are no Viking raiders. There have been harder times. And that is not to minimize the difficulty you face. But the church in that part of the world survived Viking raids. And it will survive late capitalist, neoliberal, consumer individualism too. It will. The gospel is too great. God is God, and this is God's church. So let's carry it with a lot of responsibility. And it is hard to be not living in a golden ecclesial age. It really is. I mean, maybe. Yeah. In some sense, we are still. And I think that is something to remember, is that a lot of us are still inheriting the privileges that came from earlier generations, that we're living closer to, I don't want to say golden age, but into a place where there were availabilities and resources. But we'll make it through. We'll make it through. Maybe some of us even with our pensions. Maybe not. But the gospel will continue, and the church will have life, because the church is the body of Jesus Christ. So if we can proclaim Christ and him crucified, it will continue. But there's no promise it'll be easy for any of us. Yeah, was there a hand in the back?
I was just going to add to that.
Yeah. Here, let me get this to you. Yep.
I was just going to say that in the midst of what you're saying, and really just adding to what you said really, really well, is just the fact that, as we learned at the very, very beginning of our time together, is that God is still in the business of speaking to 2-year-old daughters of atheists.
Yeah, amen.
So we might be worried about our church existing or denomination or where this is going and all that, but God is still penetrating our world with his love and guidance. And so it just struck me that in the midst of that video, that God was still speaking and getting her attention. If they're willing to listen.
Well said. Very well said. Yeah. All right. Well, I want to make sure we finish this diagram, and I know people are getting tired, and but I promised that I know that this diagram is going to get done. So we go back to my slides back there. Is that possible up there? Yeah. So. All right, so do you feel like you have a little bit of a handle of secular 1, 2, and 3? I haven't quite finished the diagram yet, but I do want to say maybe one thing that might be interesting is that I think one of the reasons these secular 3s are also kind of interesting to kind of think through is because it allows us to see things or see things that maybe we didn't see before. Like, for instance, we could say, America is the most secular of all the Western countries. Now, that could only be a true statement if you were thinking secular 1. So for instance, America is the most secular of all countries when it comes to secular one. And what I mean by that, of course, is it's in our Constitution. The bone between the state and the church breaks clean. There's a complete separation. That is not true with England. That bone does not break clean. I mean, my gosh, it's going to be in a few months. Charles is going to have his coronation, and it will be filled with liturgy. And Charles is a weirdo, and he really wants a lot of liturgy. He doesn't believe in any of it, but he wants a lot of the ancient liturgy within it. That bone does not break clean. So you could not say England or the UK is the most secular of the Western countries if you were just thinking secular one. Now, if you were saying secular two, you say America is the most secular of all the countries, well, that would be untrue. More people go to church in America than go to church in the Scandinavian countries, than France, for sure. Those are more secular. So one of the really fascinating things to think about, I mean, we've referenced sociologists, is that sociologists have two ways of figuring out how often people participate in religious communities. The two ways are they ask them, like call them up or get them to do a survey. That's one way. And the other way is you have people, a sample of people, keep a time journal. Actually write down every day what they do. What they've discovered is continental Europeans and Americans, when asked how often they go to church, both groups lie. What they state and what they do, when they look at their self-report and they look at their time journals, both groups lie. What's fascinating and illustrates this is they lie in different directions. So you ask an American, how often do you go to church? Oh, yeah, well, let me think here. Well, yeah, we go 3 times a month. Probably, actually every week. I think we always go all the time. And then they look at their time journals. They go once, 1.5 times a month. You ask a continental European, German, Scandinavian, how often do you go to church? I don't know. I think it's been 6 months since we've gone to church. I don't know. Christmas 2 years ago? We never go. Then you look at their time journals. They actually go more than they say they go, which is fascinating on how that works. That people's self-report is determined by this. But you see how these seculars play quite a bit of a difference. Now there's... maybe you know the name, the theologian's name, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Do people know Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the story of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was killed in the last days of World War II for entering into a conspiracy to be part of his brother-in-law's to take out Hitler and bring resistance, known as one of the great theologians of the 20th century. Well, Bonhoeffer actually escapes Germany before he's arrested in 1939. He finds a way out, and in many ways he was supposed to survive. So he comes to America. It's his second time. He's going to come here. They've made arrangements at Union Theological Seminary in New York for him to teach summer school. It's then been set up that he's going to do a lecture series. He's going to do pastor days all around the country. And he's going to go to colleges, seminaries, do that for a year. Clearly, he'll make some connections over that year. Somebody will invite him to a teaching position. He'll survive the war. Well, he lands in New York City to start to teach summer school. And as soon as he gets his feet on the ground in Manhattan, he regrets that he went. He knows he shouldn't be there, that he needs to go back. And he writes a letter to his former professor who made a way for him to get there, Reinhold Niebuhr, and he says, Professor Niebuhr, you don't understand. I have no right to participate in the rebuilding of the church in Germany if I don't suffer through this moment with Germany. And don't you understand, Professor Niebuhr, that my people live under a very terrible either-or. They either have to will the victory of their country and therefore the end of Christianity on the continent, or they have to will the defeat of their country and therefore the continuation of Christianity on the continent. I cannot sit this out. I have to be there. So he goes back, and then within 5 years is killed in the last days of World War II. But one of the things, one of the main documents we have from that second trip is he wrote one article. This will be hard for some of you, but remember, it's a different time. We're talking 1939, that Dietrich spent most of his time, those 3 weeks he was there, pacing in the room he was staying in, praying, and this is what will be a juxtaposition to you, smoking cigarette after cigarette, chain smoking cigarettes. I mean, it's days of madmen, like he's smoking and praying, and he knows he shouldn't be here. that he needs to go back. The only productive moment he has is he sits down and he writes an article called America, a Land of Protestantism Without Reformation. A land of Protestantism without Reformation. He makes a number of different points, but the one I want to kind of point out to you that I think helps us here a bit is it seems to be that what he's articulating is that to be a Protestant, and I think this is really true in one way or another, is to always live under crisis. That you live before God. That you live as a sinful people needing forgiveness. That Protestantism has crisis baked in. The issue with America and why he thinks it's a land of Protestantism without Reformation is because the crisis is there, but the crisis, and he wouldn't use this language, but the crisis is always a secular II crisis. People are going to leave your church. If you don't do better, people are just going to go to that bigger church across town. Yet the crisis is, we got to find a way to be better, we got to find a way to be better, we got to find a way to be better. Not the crisis is, we are people of unclean lips. We are people who need to give our deaths over to God daily and find God moving within them. And he thinks this is what it means to be, in the broadest kind of sense, living in the Reformation tradition, is the crisis is actually God's act. It's a crisis. Because God comes with a word of judgment to bring grace out of it. God comes to bring new life out of death. It's a very different imagination than the crisis is. Get your crap together. Or your own little small business church is going to disappear. As opposed to, here are these people that I have to walk with, that I even have to prepare to live before God and die before God. How do I do that? I mean, it is a strange world we live in. Taylor wants to tell us that we've constructed a world where, like I said earlier, we can take breaks from God. Most other places in the world could never imagine that. And most other times, for sure, no one could ever imagine you could take a break from God. It's a weird society that you can go a long time without thinking about God. But that's coupled with and interconnected with that we are even a weirder society, because you can go a long time in this society without even thinking about your death. Again, I think you have to be at a particular privileged place to do that. But, I mean, it's what we hold up in our media and our marketing and things like that. And try it, especially if you're in a middle class situation. Remind people that they're going to die sometime. They do not like it. They find it very offensive to remind them that they're going to die. And yet it is a fact. And a huge core of what it used to mean to be a pastor was, how are you preparing people to have a Christian death? And that is happening. And that's not sadistic. It's not saying your life now doesn't matter. It actually says your life now really, really matters, because it's finite. I did this there's a book by Todd Billings, who's a theologian at Western Seminary, who's been living with terminal cancer for quite a while. I mean, his medication is basically keeping him alive, and he's written some really beautiful books, memoirs about his experience. But he wrote one just a year and a half ago or something on a Christian death, and how within the tradition, it's always been a central piece of pastoral practice to think about what it means to die well, what it means to die a Christian death. Really great book. I was fascinated by it. So I went to dinner with my kids, and I said, we were passing the fajitas, and I got the guacamole and passed it, and I said, so kids, how are you guys preparing to die? And my daughter, 14 at the time, pushed herself away from the table and goes, Dad, go. It was almost as if I just said, hey, I just want you kids to know, at bedtime, I'm going to lock our door, and your mom and I are going, she was so disgusted by it. It was the most disgusting. She said, Dad, oh my gosh, it's terrible. And I think she really embodies this kind of certain middle class ethos of she does not want to think about the fact that she's going to die. But this is the reality that we live in. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is your whole kind of disposition as a pastor, as a minister, could be just thinking how can we just get more and more growth? Or you can think of the utter privilege you have to walk with people. There's nowhere else in society that will walk long-term with people as they're living lives and moving towards death. I mean, I know there's hospice, and the ministry that nurses do and other technicians. I mean, it's amazing. But one of the things that formed our family probably more than anything over the pandemic is that right weeks before the pandemic started, in our church there's a couple named Brian and Jen. And they were in their early 40s, and they had kind of met late, and they were just these kind of two lost souls that found each other and fell deeply, deeply in love. Had a daughter, late, older parents, had a daughter, and she was 3, and just the absolute just treasure of their life. Well, she starts having pain in her chest. She goes to multiple doctors, and they tell her it's probably just fine. She finally goes to one, they run some scans, and she has terrible breast cancer. So our whole pandemic is, one of the great beauties of the pandemic, I don't know if you feel this way, but for all the terrible things, at least we learned that Zoom is actually a pretty good platform to pray with people through. It's terrible for a lot of stuff, but it is pretty good to pray with people. So Cara, my wife, and Jen and Brian, and then our ministry associate, our quarter-time ministry associate, started meeting every morning and every evening, 15 minutes to pray with them. 2 years. Our lives were set that way. Cara, 7 a.m., prays with Jen and Brian till 7:15. Every night at 7 p.m., she prays with them. It just sets the terms for our life. And it's the up and down. It looks like maybe they found a way. No, she's sick. April of last year, we're moving close to a year, she dies. And it just is heart-wrenching. And now Brian has lived as a single dad, losing his soulmate and now raising this soon-to-be kindergartner. Last September, she's now in kindergarten, and we see her at church. And Brian's just barely, hanging on at these moments. And the grief, just how do you grieve, and how do you have, how do you be a parent? Well, there's little Ava, and her head is just like rat's nest in the back. And of course, you know what you do when you get in the car after church. You tell stories, you're not in a mean way, but you're like, how'd you see Ava? Yeah, poor Brian, he's probably barely hanging on, keeping it all together. Well, a week later, they're in a Bible study, and Brian just has this incredibly beautiful moment where he just says, I'm really seeking for connection in a deep way because I just don't know what to do. And he says, for instance, I just don't know what to do. That I have this little girl, and I see the back of her head, and I see that it's just a rat's nest. So we were wrong to begin with. He knows what's going on. But he says, I don't know what to do, that she won't let me comb her hair because that's what mommy used to do. And she's just walking with these people through this. Is that the heart of it? Or is that superfluous to get more people in? We can't be superficial about the fact that we need people around. And if you're a pastor, you got to keep the lights on. But never at the cost of walking the long road, the bumpy road of being with people in life and death. It's an incredible privilege to be a pastor, to be with people in these moments. And you bear it. You bear it in your body, how hard it is to grieve them, the stories you have to hear. But there is almost nowhere else where anyone will do that, and particularly without instrumental desire. It's part of our biggest problem of being modern people is that almost every relationship we have gets so easily instrumentalized. Is that the point of the relationship is to get something else. But at its core, pastoral ministry is just being with people. For the sake of what? Being with them. Because in the midst of just being with them, there is something profound that happens. The God who is with us in Jesus Christ. For what purpose? To participate in God's life. Salvation is participating in the life of God. To such an extent that Paul says, you no longer live, but Christ lives in you. that deep participation. So pastoral ministry, to participate in people's lives, is the gift. And it also is heavy. But the sense that God is moving through it, I think, is what becomes so deeply significant. All right, so we're still getting there. So if we add this part of the diagram, so if it's not participate, but it's really believe again through encounter. It's this deep sense of believing again through encounter. That's what I meant when I said we have to testify to this. We have to give our best account. And I don't mean believe again as some kind of deconstructive move, as much as that we do have to pick this up and live it every day. It's believing again through this deep sense of encounter. All right, so if we're going to give our two words here, there would be a difference between dwelling and searching. I think one of the reasons that secular 2 can be such a problem is because what we're really after is making dwellers, people who stay here. And this is kind of reflective of Taylor, because as a Catholic, he's very concerned that the church becomes more concerned about just getting more people to dwell in the Catholic schools, in Catholic congregations, and not to mine and search for the depth of God's beauty and act within the world. So I think pastoral ministry isn't about making more dwellers, but about the invitation to journey with people as they search. Now there's an irony here within Protestantism, because searching is often the way we think about it is, seeker sensitivity is about reaching out to searchers, and it becomes actually a strategy for secular too. But I think what we really mean is this deep sense of seeking for God, these stories, like we heard from Rachel, creating space for that to reflect on that. All right, we're probably far too late in the day. I guess another way we could think about this is takes and spins. Like we said before, is it about takes or is it about spins? Has that made enough sense to folks? Takes and spins? Do you feel like you got that enough? All right, so why are we actually in secular 3? Why should we even assume that this is where we're at? Is because I think these two things, I've given you like the 3 marks of secular 0 and the 2 marks of secular 2. Well, here are 2 marks of secular 3 that I think are pretty fundamental, and we are getting pretty late in the day, so I don't want to beat a dead horse here. And these, we probably could have focused all our attention on these. But we are living in a time where we have a new ethic. And the new ethic is what we've been kind of pointing to, and we were even talking about consumerism, the kind of post-68 reality that we were talking about. The new ethic is an ethic of authenticity. So we have this assumption, you know this in your bones, and it's everywhere in the cultural context, that we make the presumption that every human being should have a right to define for themselves what it means for them to be human. And the ethic of that drive towards authenticity is that no human being should ever tell another human being what it means for that human being to be human. This is the ethic of authenticity. And it really is a kind of post-68 kind of reality. And it's something that's existed long before that, but it only existed in small enclaves. Like poets in Weimar and painters in Paris and beat poets in New York City believe these kind of things. But what is really fascinating about post-1968 and what happens there is that kind of bohemian, romantic authenticity drive becomes all of us now. We're all romantics in one way or another. And like I said, it comes on the infrastructure of consumerism and on marketing. That the way we're marketed to is that it's not, you shouldn't buy a product because of what it does. You should buy a product because of what it means. And it allows you to express your individuality. So as an individual, you need to find your most authentic way of being yourself. And you should listen to no one who tries to impose on you what it means to be you. And if you ever are on Twitter, you realize that there a lot of policing around authenticity goes on. People will run to the defense of people who are being told how they should live their lives, or vice versa, and it never goes anywhere because people just yell at each other. But this is the ethic of authenticity. But it's also embedded in a deep sense of a kind of new authority. And the new authority, of course, is you really should only follow what speaks to you. If it doesn't speak to you, it could work for Kyle, but it doesn't need to mean it works for me. Well, that's cool that Kyle finds that powerful and important, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything to me. It's got to speak to me. So there's a New Testament professor that I know who likes to tell this story and loves to tell it in rooms filled with pastors. And it's a story about meeting this young man who happened to be a big weightlifter guy. And he meets him and they start talking, and this guy's like a new Christian, and he's just really, really into his faith. Like, he loves talking about it. And at first, the New Testament professor is a little like, gosh, this is kind of obnoxious. But the more he talks to him, the more the guy kind of wins him over. It's like, oh, this guy's really intense. But I guess as a weightlifter, you would be. But, he's like, this guy seems pretty genuine. And so he's talking to him for a while, and he says, he gets his story, and he says, can I ask you a really weird question? The New Testament professor says, I study the New Testament, but I also study early martyrdom in the church, first, second century martyrdom. So I want to ask you this weird question. He says, I'm asking you this because I really respect you, but I'm wondering, you're so deeply into Jesus, and you keep saying you so deeply love Jesus. I'm wondering, do you think you would die for Jesus? Just theoretically, do you think you would die? The weightlifter guy, to his credit, kind of steps back, and he really ponders it. He really thinks about it. He says, you know what? Yeah, I think I would die for Jesus if I had to. And the New Testament professor believed him. He thought I think he might. He's like, man, I am impressed with you. I am really impressed. He's like, so you got to tell me then, where do you go to church? Where do you worship on Sundays? And the guy goes, well, I don't. Wait, what? He said, no, I don't worship on Sundays. He said, why? He said, well, I just find it boring. It's just completely boring to me. Wait. You're on fire for Jesus. You love Jesus. I love Jesus. You die for Jesus. Yes, I would die for Jesus. But you don't go to church. No, it's boring. So then the New Testament professor says to this room of pastors, so I say to the guy, let me get this straight. You're willing to die for Jesus, but not be bored for Jesus? And all the pastors in the room stand up and are like, yeah, get on, professor. Yeah, we lead worship services and they matter. Just gets into it. And it's a great story, and I think ultimately I agree with the New Testament professor. There's a major inconsistency there. But at another level, the New Testament professor doesn't quite understand how this new authority works. And what the young man was saying doesn't speak to me. So it doesn't just feel like, it's not completely superficial. It may have a level of superficiality to it. But his point is being bored is worse than death in some ways. There's no sense of me finding my authenticity if it's boring. It is a roadblock to authenticity if it's not speaking to me. It's a very different kind of challenge in the context of pastoral ministry. Now, Taylor wants to say these two moves, especially the ethic of authenticity. He wants to say this is ultimately a good thing. I think it's a kind of open conversation. And remember, Taylor's 92 years old. So he does not have Twitter or TikTok, and I don't know what he would say now in that. And he'd probably say, what is TikTok, is what he would actually say. So there's certain ways that this has become really unwieldy at some level. But at a certain way, he wants to think this is good. It's good that we allow those who didn't have voice to speak of their experience before to speak of it now. But it does also become a challenge. How do you form people when forming people does mean, not heavy-handed, but you got to kind of tell them what it means to live their life. It's a challenge. Now, Taylor can tell you, and I think this is probably as far as we'll go, but Taylor tells you that he can tell you how you're dealing with the age of authenticity and new ethic. And again, he's open that we can definitely find Christian expressions in these. But he can tell you, he says, I think I can tell you if you have an open take or a closed spin. I have a test, which after 770 pages, you're like, I could use a test here. And here's his test. He says, let me tell you the story of St. Francis. And in the good Catholic response, how you respond to the story of St. Francis, he thinks, can give him a pretty good clue if you're open take or closed spin. Now, I love this picture of St. Francis because it looks like, I think it was like a Renaissance picture or something, but it just looks like it's a Marvel movie. If there was a producer here, they would make St. Francis the Marvel character. But here's, many of you know the story of St. Francis, but it goes like this, and this is what Taylor says, listen to this story and see how you react. So you know Francis. Francis is a boy of quite a bit of privilege. His father is a cloth dealer and makes a lot of money, and he is supposed to inherit the family business. Well, Francis, as you know, a young adult, also gets really into something. And what he gets really into is going into a cave and praying. And he starts hearing God speak to him in this cave. Well, his dad's trying to give the business over to him, at least down the road, and he says, why don't you take this cart of fine cloth and go to the next town and sell it? Francis goes. He sells every piece of cloth, and he sells the cart. He walks back with a bag full of money. He sees a little chapel outside of Assisi. He walks into it. He finds the priest there, and he begs the priest to take the money. He doesn't want it. The priest is smart enough to be like, nope, I'm not taking the money. So Francis, who is a weirdo, takes the money and throws it out the window. He wants nothing to do with it. He then begs the priest to stay at the chapel. The priest allows him to stay in the chapel. He's there about 2 weeks. His family starts getting very worried about where he is. I think his dad's very worried about where the bag of money is. They finally find him in the chapel. They bring him home over and against his will. They lock him in his room, and they want him to get in his right mind. He tells them he has decided he's giving up everything for God. They think God's great. That's cool. We give money to the church and stuff, but no. After weeks, I want to give my life to God. They finally go into his room and they think they're going to scare him straight. They say, fine, you're unrelenting, so you can give up and follow God. You can give this all up and follow God. But you have to go before the bishop and you have to renounce your father's inheritance and give that all up. And I do think they think this will scare him straight. Like he'll go before the bishop and the bishop's like, are you renouncing all the privileges of your father's house? And he'll say, yes, except the house in Maui, I'll keep that. You know, that's what they think is going to happen. So they bring him before the bishop, and the bishop says, is this true? Are you giving up all of this? And Francis says, I am, and the very clothes on my back. And remember, he's a weirdo. So he takes off all his clothes and stands stark naked before the priest. And then spends a week or so naked, walking around Assisi, giving this all up. But Taylor's point is, if I tell you that story, how you react to it will tell me a lot. If your response to that story is, there it is. Religion is a terrible thing that makes people do the stupidest stuff. I mean, there it is, pure manipulation. Who gets the money after all? Oh. Come on. I mean, why would you be so stupid? He says, clothespin. But if your response to it is, ooh, actually it's kind of frightening. I'm not sure I could do that if God called me to it. Actually, I'm quite frightened that God could call me to do that. But wow, that you could live a human life doing that. I don't know, man, that makes me think deep thoughts. He says, well, you're probably an open spin person. Now, that's what he would say. I would say, because I've been corrupted by television, watch the movie Jeff Who Lives at Home. Has anyone seen the movie Jeff Who Lives at Home? Well, let me give you my official review of this movie. Average. Not a great movie. Now, please respect that. Take that in. Think, what presentation have you been at where someone's going to talk extensively about a movie, which their official review is, it might be worth your time. I don't know. It is 3 stars, but it illustrates something really, I think, important about this. So in this movie, if you watch it, it's about 2 main characters, Jeff, who lives at home, played by Jason Segel, and his older brother, Pat. Now, Jeff is your classic young adult who has failed to launch. He is living in his parents' basement, smoking pot, and not sure what he's doing. Pat has launched. He's selling stereo equipment. And Pat is living for a dream. He has a major horizon of what will make the life good, and he's going after it. And that is driving a Porsche. He wants to own a Porsche. Well, the movie starts, and both of these men have just experienced a kind of loss in their life. About 5 years ago, their father died. And it's really thrown Jeff for a loop. He can't figure out what's going on with this, why his dad died. Pat tries not to think about it. Well, Pat gets his Porsche. The movie starts by him showing his wife, honey, I've done it. I've lived our dream. It's out front. Here are the keys. It's not her dream. She sees the Porsche. She doesn't know how ends are going to meet. She's very angry. Well, Jeff's at home in the basement, and the phone rings. He picks it up, and his mom says, Jeff, get your butt out of the house. Go to the hardware store, get some glue. We need to fix a shutter. Get out of the house. Oh, fine. Hangs up the phone rings again. Thinks it's his mom. He picks it up. On the other line, someone says, hey, is Kevin there? I'm sorry, you have the wrong number. Hey, don't lie to me. Get Kevin on the phone. No, man, there's no Kevin here. Get Kevin on the phone. Get him right now. I mean it, get Kevin. No, there is no Kevin here. No, get Kevin on the phone. I want to talk. You have the wrong number. There is no Kevin. Get Kevin on the phone. Click. Jeff steps back and thinks, Kevin. What does it mean? What could this possibly mean? He thinks there's some meaning to this call. So he gets out of his house, he goes to the bus stop to get this glue, and he sees there's this kid in a basketball jersey. And on the back of the basketball jersey, it says, Kevin. So he decides he's going to follow it, that there's got to be some meaning, there's got to be some purpose. There has to be some reason all this sorrow has happened in his life with the loss of his dad. So he follows Kevin, and he watches him play basketball for a while, and then he starts playing. Then they start talking. Then they kind of hit it off, and it looks like they're going to become friends. And then Kevin beats him up and steals his money. So, dead end. But then there he sees Pat. And Pat now is pretty sure that his wife might be having an affair. So Jeff joins him, and they try to figure out what's going on. And it becomes a little like a buddy movie. Well, at one point, they end up in a cemetery where their father is buried, just by happenstance, trying to figure out what his wife's doing and who she's meeting with. And Pat has this one moment where he kind of has an openness. He says, they're looking at their dad's tombstone, and Pat says, I keep on having this dream. And in this dream, Dad keeps saying to me, and he says what Dad says. And Jeff looks at him, and this is what Jeff has wanted forever. He says, yeah, Pat, yes, this is it. Pat, I have that same dream. Dad says that same thing to me. It's got to mean something. And then Pat can't take that openness, so he steps back and is like, well, I mean, it must be just some psychological reaction. I mean, it must have been something Dad said to us long ago that we remembered. And he spins it close again, and it really frustrates Jeff. Well, the movie ends with him on a bridge in bumper-to-bumper traffic, and Pat realizes his wife's ahead, and he runs in the car, and he sees her, and they reconcile. And supposedly Jeff has discovered what his life's been all about, help his brother reconcile with his wife. And he says to the cabbie, you ever think you'd find your purpose in life, and it would just be more? Cabbie has no idea what he's saying. The next scene, we see Jeff running on the bridge, sprinting on the bridge. We now get a glimpse of why there's bumper-to-bumper traffic. A car has gone off the bridge, is submerged in the river, and is sinking. The next thing we know, Jeff is jumping off the bridge into the water. He swims over to the car. He goes under the water. He pulls 2 young children out of it. He pulls these 2 girls out. They pop to the surface. They come up, and they say, our daddy's under there. Our daddy's under there. So Jeff takes a deep breath and goes back under the water. And he's under there a pretty long time. Car is really starting to submerge. Then a head pops up. It's the dad. He swims over to his girls. And then the water goes really still. And if this was a French movie, the credits would roll. And you would like it and be sad. But this is not a French movie. This is an American movie. So just when you wonder, is Jeff dead? He pops up and he swims over. The final scene of the movie is Jeff back in his mom's basement, sitting in front of the TV, and a news story comes on. Terrible accident on bridge, whatever. Car goes in. 2 little girls on TV. We don't know what we would have done if we would have lost our daddy. Our daddy means everything to us. The very wound that Jeff is living out of, the loss of his father, that compels him to minister to another, to make sure they don't have to bear the same loss that he has. His loss is what compels him to participate so deeply in the lives of another. But of course, then we see the father come on the screen. And he says, this is a terrible accident, but of course his name at the bottom says Kevin Ryder. Point being, are you Jeff or are you Pat? Is there some bigger purpose, some possibility that would even lead you to give and care for another, to participate in their death experience for the sake of life? Or are we Pats, just spinning things closed? A Porsche, that would make life good. Or is life good, the goodness of life, this bound to a bigger story, to a bigger purpose, to a bigger calling? Are we pastoring people to be Pats or to be Jeffs? To seek for maybe there's a purpose, even to our deepest suffering, that God is redeeming it and through it calling us into ministry. All right, this is my final story and point for us today, is to think about what is faith and to tell you my favorite Pauline epistle. My favorite Pauline epistle is 2 Corinthians. You shouldn't have favorites, they say. It's like with your kids, you shouldn't have favorites. You have Owen and you have Maisie, and I don't have favorites, and Maisie is the favorite. It's like every parent says they don't have favorites, but they always have one favorite, So my favorite Pauline epistle is 2 Corinthians, and I love it because it's just, I don't know, it's just rich with intrigue. So if you know anything about Corinth in the ancient world, that Corinth is like the Las Vegas of the ancient world. It's not the seat of power, but cool stuff happens in Corinth. And Paul has founded a church right in this Las Vegas, and he's founded it on the Strip. And, Paul starts his church, and he has to leave. He goes and starts other churches. So while Paul is gone, between 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, a bunch of new members show up at this church. And they happen to work on the Strip. They are producing the Britney Spears show, and they are, they founded the Blue Man Group. These are these kind of people. Well, they've read Paul's circular letters. They like them. Paul's letters are powerful. And so now they get word Paul's coming back through town. He's going to come visit Corinth again, and they're excited about this because the Pauls of the letter, there's something. And they wonder, these could play. The marquee, Paul preaching, this could really be something. Well, what 2 Corinthians is Paul's response to that visit. And it doesn't go so well. Because in these Corinthians' minds, they really think, when they have a picture of who Paul is, they really see Brad Pitt. They just think this guy is powerful and wonderful. Yet there's a problem. When Paul shows up, he is not Brad Pitt. He looks a lot more like Danny DeVito. And they're like, what? No. This is the Paul of the letters? No. Well, they cope with it a little bit because they're like, okay. Maybe Paul isn't, anything to look at. Okay, well, we get that. But his preaching's probably amazing. So then he goes and preaches, and they're like, ooh. It's not terrible, but there's no marquee. We couldn't. He couldn't open for Britney Spears. No. So what 2 Corinthians is Paul's response to this. And I guess I really like it because it is the most passive-aggressive of all Pauline epistles, and I'm from a very passive-aggressive place in Minnesota. And so, it's very passive-aggressive. Paul's like, oh, yeah, you've been throwing shade on me? Well, I could tell you stuff that, no one's missed more meals for the gospel than me. I could tell you that. I'm not going to tell you that, but I could tell you that. No one's been beaten more for the gospel than me. I could tell you that, but I'm not going to tell you that. I even know a dude who's been taken into the third heaven. I could tell you that, but I'm not going to tell you that. And you're kind of like, Paul, you're telling them. You really are telling them by not telling them. But after his whole Paul passive-aggressive thing, he gets to the very heart of his theological argument. And he says to these Corinthians, you're right. It's a beautiful moment. He says, you're right. You are absolutely right. I am nothing to look at, and I'm an average preacher at best. But don't you forget it, you Corinthians. Don't you forget that, of course, God would call someone like me to proclaim his gospel. Because don't you forget, your God comes into the world beaten on a cross. This is who your God is. Faith is trust in this, that what is dead, God is making alive. That starts in God's own body in the person of Jesus Christ. And this is what it means to do ministry. To herald to the world that the God of Israel takes what is dead and brings life out of it. And what we do is we wait for that. What we do is name it when we experience it as a sacrament. What we do is think we're human beings share deeply in each other's lives, ministering to one another. We think it's not only re-enchanted, but it's sacramental. The infinite and the finite commingle when ministry happens. I really want you to leave knowing that ministry is such an incredibly powerful thing. It is the only form of human action that can share in death and participate in life coming out of death. It's more powerful than the human action of defending the law and being a lawyer, being an entrepreneur, being a professional athlete. It is the most powerful human form of action, ministry. But its power rests in its weakness. Its weakness to listen. Its weakness to give a look and walk a long haul with people. That's where its power rests, and it's underneath. But it is beautiful, and it is worth giving your life to. But as Paul reminds us in 2 Corinthians, it will always be crucified. It will always come underneath, but it is deeply, deeply powerful. Let me pray for us. God, thank you for these people in this room and the people on Zoom. You've called them, and your call is sure, but your call is not easy. And its difficulty does not rest in being able to turn low relevance into high or minimal resources into many more. The long, hard road is the invitation to really be with people, to really walk with them, to really attend to their stories so that we might proclaim beside them and for them that you, God, are indeed at work, bringing life out of death. So we leave here, God, asking for faith, which of course is sure trust in you, but it's a trust that reaches so deep that it surrenders to the reality that you are a God who brings life out of death. So give us the bravery to be the kind of ministers that enter into death, not to glorify death, but to anticipate and participate as a sacrament in life coming out of death. May we be in your presence, God, and may it be enough. Amen. Thank you all.
Thank you, and thank you for spending your day with us. And those online, make sure you grab an extra book. We have some ways for you to buy additional books that Andy has written out and back, and we'll see you next year, hopefully. So take care.